Hello everybody and welcome to Google Hangouts for week 2.
Hello.
We've had a fantastic week of comments from you and lots of really interesting things happening. As you can see, you have myself, Alison, and
Giovanna. I'm back.
Yeah, this week.
Again.
And we've also got some great people who've joined us as well. So this week so far we can see we've got Chris and Kerry and Catherine and Kasia. We've got Lisa and Ahmed and Rita already just with us, and Katja and Stephanie, and quite a few other people joining up, which is just wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us. And we'll just keep watching and seeing who else comes on board as we go through. And we've got pages of questions from you. We've spent a really interesting few days looking over the questions and thinking about them and wanting to respond. So we're going to spend a few minutes going over some of those questions with you first, and we'll look out for your on-loan questions as we come. Maybe before we start though, just to summarise what we've been going through this week. So what we've been looking at this week is issues of power in language and issues of plenty in language, issues of danger and domination, and issues of deficit, and some of the different ways in which we actually look at these. So you might remember looking at Katja's lovely blog post about learning a Chinese song at the Language Fest and how she discovered something more about her humanity in doing that. You might remember posting up on the school maps, and we've been really enjoying looking at all the different places where you learnt language, but also thinking about the choices that are made in different contexts by school authorities, by governments, as to which language you would learn in your school as opposed to the ones which might have been reflected more in your community. We spent a lot of time with this great book and this great resource, and Giovanna's a real expert on this at the moment, thinking about what verbal hygiene means, and the comments again that you've made about the way in which we clean up language as a way of issuing power, but also many questions from you as language teachers worrying a bit about how we do that well, because of course we do need to understand one another, and it is important for us to speak well and to think about questions of accuracy or pronunciation. So we're going to come back to many of those questions overall. But just before we do, we've got a nice surprise for you, because one of the other things that we've been doing this week is looking at a poem, a very powerful poem that you've had lots of comments about, called Good English, by a poet who is resident in Glasgow, originally from Zimbabwe, Tawana Sithole. And so he's just popped along in between various things he's doing at the moment as part of Glasgow International Festival. And you've asked, here he is, and this is Tawana.
Hello.
And you've asked that he might recite a poem to you in one of his mother tongues. And so, Tawana, we're just going to hand over to you to do that before we start on the Google Hangouts questions. Thank you.
Ekani pamsoroi varipano padenderedzwa rino topira kumatimana ese nyika kuchamembe kumaodza nyemba kumabvira zuva nekumadokero ini ndiniganya matope ndichiyamwa mbizi nokumbira kutenda kuti tasangana pano nenhetembo yekutarisa kwatabva tasiya mashambanzou tichisangana nezuva kuseni. Pano tinofamba nenhetembo yachinjenga mutsvairo. Ndaifunga kuti ndacherechedza ndichiti aiwa ndapedzeredza, asi nganga yakuringa pasi. Ndaiti ndacherechedza ndichiti ndapedzeredza, asi chapungu chakuringa pasi. Ndicho charinga chepwere vakuru we. Ndiniganya matope kwenyamira musango. Dende, dova, dende, dova. Ndiniganya matope kwenyambira musango. Icho chinjenga mutsvairo chinomona. Chinjenga mutsvairo chinomona. Musango resango. Ndiniganya matope. Ndaiti ndapedzeredza. Ndichiti ndacherechedza. Asi nganga yakuringa pasi. Ekani.
Thank you so much, Tawana, and thank you for making a few moments to come along and just let us listen in to that soundscape of language that is from a different part of the world to the one we're in at the moment, that comes to us with all sorts of resonances. Go
So
on,
we
Joanna.
just wanted to pick, is it Shona? Was it Shona?
It's a mix of Shona and Dao. So
Yeah,
Okay.
beautiful. So 2 of your languages, yeah.
yes, and I greeted everyone and respecting the space that we're all sharing, and greeted everyone from all sides, from all 4 corners of the globe, and then I went into my little poem.
Yeah, that's beautiful. We're so grateful to you for coming. Thank you so much and for explaining what that was. And we're going to wish you well on your way and with the work you're doing today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So glad to be part of this.
Yeah.
Enjoy.
Lovely.
Thank
Hekani.
Okay.
Okay. Bye, Donna.
Bye.
Yeah, so that was our little surprise for you for this week, and we hope you enjoyed hearing some of that language and the way it's spoken, and that responds a little to what it's like to hear language that we are really privileged to hear, but hear so rarely in our English worlds. So maybe we can move on and start looking at some of the questions, Joanna.
Some of the questions.
And we've had great comments from lots of different people, and we've categorized these under 5 different headings. So there's the challenges of mono and multilingualism. There are the questions of English as the language of a globalized world. There's the question of linguistic power relations. There's the question of Scottish languages and power relations, given that this is where we are, and some questions as well about language decisions and spending justifications, so almost into the economics of language policy, as well as some other really fascinating questions that are sort of more one-off. So we'll take a bit of time to go through those between us, and we'll keep an eye out for other questions that might be coming up on the side of the screen for us here. And maybe if we start off with a question that Stephanie's asked us, which was that Stephanie's curious if we're in danger of having too many languages in the world.
A multilingual overdose was Stephanie was asking, are we in danger of having a multilingual overdose? And I think we're probably not in danger of a multilingual overdose. It is estimated that carrying on as we are, half of the 6,000 and plus languages that are currently spoken in the world will disappear by the end of the century. So languages are actually becoming fewer and fewer, and we're losing languages. So there's no danger, I think, of a multilingual overdose. And moreover, that provided that we can move between languages and learn them and use them, the number of languages we have doesn't really have to be an issue. Whether we have 6,000 or 6,000 or 7,000, I don't think it's going to make a massive issue, provided that we can move between them and be open to learn them and to exchange.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's some really interesting writing and thinking going on about these questions at the moment, Stephanie. And I think this question of a multilingual overdose, you've expressed it really well there as a question. At the moment, 2 of the leading scholars in applied linguistics, Jan Blomert and Aneta Pavlenko, are having quite a debate about this very issue. Jan Blomert represents a position where he's using a term by somebody called Vertevex of superdiversity, and he's arguing in a nutshell that we're living in very different conditions in the world today, that the digital nature of the world, the speed, the space-time compression, the way in which people have migrated and can migrate more quickly in some areas, the concentration of people into multilingual cities, into migratory cities, that this is creating something quite unique in history, and that there is something of a multilingual overdose in that sense, and he's calling that superdiversity. Aneta Pavlenko, who's also an applied linguist, is arguing, and she's a historical linguist as well, and she's really saying this situation is maybe not as unique as we might want to think, and it's very easy for us always to think that our place in history is unique in some way, and it is unique, but there are also always patterns and traces of human behavior in the past. And some of the things that Pavlenko talks about are, for example, migratory cities under Roman occupation in the Middle East, the fact that many languages are represented. They might not be represented in digital form, obviously, but they're written onto stones in different languages. There are translations written onto in different inscriptions, and that we've always lived in multilingual ways and multilingual worlds. And language contact then means we raise these questions. And that idea of a multilingual overdose kind of points a little bit to our fear of things we don't understand, perhaps. So I think those are really significant questions, important that you're raising there, Stephanie.
Can I just link, and I'm jumping a few questions ahead, but Margarita asked about the difference between translanguaging, bilingualism and hybridization, and trying to be very, very brief. Translanguages is changing between languages, verbal and non-verbal languages within a conversation. So, and you need to be bilingual to know more than one language in order to do this, in order to be able to borrow from different languages, to choose the one, the way to convey more precisely what you mean. And hybridization, if I pronounce it correctly, brings back to this idea that language, the contact between languages has always happened, and no language is pure. You know, we only have to think about English and the words that come from Latin, well, they come from French, from various, from Arabic, from various other languages, and more and more languages are so cross-breeding, but it's something which is not unique, and it's not just happening to English, it's happening everywhere, and it's not just happening now, but it's happened historically over time. That's how languages evolve and change.
And I think in some ways that also points to some of the themes that we'll be looking at next week, which is about languages as a creative art. We're making with languages through these contact zones we're in. And in that space as well, some scholars like Angela Kreis, for example, have begun to argue that maybe language isn't quite appropriate as a term for what we're talking about. She would point to the way we could talk about a repertoire, again drawing on quite creative metaphors for thinking about languages. She would point to the way in which we think about languages as codes, that we switch between codes of discourses. So there's lots of ways in which the category and the idea of a language as discrete, and therefore as of multilingualism, is beginning to be just picked away at, tested, and people are trying out other ways of trying to describe what it means to live in these super diverse multilingual worlds, what it means to be creating a different soundscape with our speech, but also with our writing as part of a multilingual aesthetic in the way that we've talked about also in week 1.
And this time, after the experience of last week, we've actually managed to get the questions on site. So if any of you want to pose questions, we do have the questions. We have Miriam there, who was actually thanking Tawona for this poem, and we will give Tawona your thank yous, Miriam. And I think we have, it might be a case of a different Miriam, but it might be the same Miriam. There was a suggestion about the fact that being multilingual, that having many languages should be seen as a responsibility. And I think that that's a really interesting idea and a really important observation that Miriam made. However, when we open up the spaces for many languages, to spaces to learn languages and to speak languages, this is where the power dimensions come into play. Which languages we allow a space to, which languages we leave out, is always going to be a matter of power relations, and being clear about this is quite an essential, quite an important.
And within that also of power relations in terms of who are the decision makers at different levels of policy making. So who are the decision makers in schools or in families? Who are the decision makers in governments? Who are the decision makers in community organisations or in local authorities, in town halls? So those decision makers and how they make decisions about language use is very significant. And I think we've had some very interesting experiences of watching those decision makers change their positions in Scotland, and I'm sure you have in different parts of the world yourselves. And that raises questions, I think, like Daniela's question, which I really enjoyed. Daniela, thank you for that, about multilingualism in communities. And you say, Daniela, that I read that in Africa, most of the people are multilingual. And you're wanting to know a bit about how that works. And you'll have already met in our closing video, Nadensua and Gamali, and the way they can just switch really easily between different languages. You've just heard Tawana giving you a poem by heart in Nadao and in Shona. And for those of us who've been brought up in contexts often in the global north that are monolingual, where our nation states choose one language as an official language or promote one language through the decision making, then it's a bit of a mystery to us as to how it can work in a context where, for example, in Eritrea, where there are 9 different official languages, or in South Africa, where it's a very similar situation, a state chooses to promote lots of different languages as its official languages, and therefore those can be chosen and used in different contexts. But Daniela, in asking how that works, some of the research I've been doing recently around this has been really fascinating. And I've been watching how, in Ghana in particular, people will switch between codes or repertoires very regularly, but even more interestingly, they'll help each other along in different circumstances. And so that a phrase that is used regularly is, in my language we say that, or in my culture we would express this way, or we have a saying like this. So that in everyday interactions between us, we're almost always translating or building in a pedagogy of languages to our everyday interactions. Now that's very different to a circumstance where we just assume everybody speaks the same language, and therefore we assume we don't need to explain. And some of what we're talking about when we're thinking about migratory aesthetics with you is about how we're starting to build some of those things in, how we might be slowing down or translating, or asking people and inviting people in with different perspectives, or asking people, as you have done this week with Tawana, to think about speaking and to invite them to speak in a language that we might not understand at all, but we want to have the experience of hearing.
And I think we can move on to one of the questions that came under sort of the linguistic power relations, and I think it was Trevor that sent us a link to a Guardian article, which we'd actually all seen and marvelled at, in which David Cameron exhorted, or even more so, decided that it was time for Muslim women to learn English so that they could be saved from radicalization. And the idea that a language in itself is a vehicle of either democracy and human rights and so on, and another language is a vehicle for radicalization and obscurantism and backwardness, etc. So, and this really brings it back to Deborah Cameron idea of herbal hygiene, and how languages and differences between languages and the languages we speak and the languages we allowed to be the dominant languages embody a lot more than just the language, where they stand for something else. And in this case, they stand for the idea that our language, our culture is more progressive than other people's cultures and languages, and that all you have to do is to learn English in order to get rid of to get rid of radicalization, when it's actually clear from what we know that global networks of terrorism, for example, couldn't function without using a common language, and very likely this language is English. And many of the people who are radicalized and join Daesh in Syria were born in Britain in this case, and grew up speaking English. So speaking English is not a cure for all the ills in the world, and making people learn a language is not just a cure. There's another agenda there that speaks about the politics of the war against terror and migration in this case.
Absolutely, and I think there's something very important in that also links with some of the things we were looking at last week with David Gramling's work on the invention of monolingualism and how he's understanding monolingualism, and also what monolingualism has achieved. It's achieved quite a lot. To have states determine a particular language that would be spoken. It's achieved certain forms of transparency, it's achieved certain ways of organizing the world, but it has also led to situations that we find ourselves in today around multilingualism and some of those things we want to think critically about. And this question that you asked, Trevor, around the question of a policy which will require everyone to learn English, I think points to two really important aspects. One is the way languages are increasingly being used as part of a security apparatus. And again, Deborah Cameron talks about this in her book, Verbal Hygiene, the way increasingly language learning is linked to immigration status, is linked to the right to migrate, is linked to citizenship tests in many of the rich world countries, and that this issue of requiring everyone to learn English at a particular level is also about a level of state security. So some of that is about saying we want these women to learn English so that if we question them about activities through the police, we will understand that what they say directly. And I think there's something there that's important on two levels. One is that we can never be fully transparent to one another in the ways that Giovanna has just been describing, and that it is important that we learn to live with the fact we can never understand every language in the world, that we will always have things that are opaque, are closed to us, that we do not understand, and that living in multilingual worlds is about that. But some of the experiences we have of language, and that you were very much part of those questions you answered at in the pre-course discussions around how you feel when you don't understand a language, are really about our own internal fears of things we don't understand. Our fear that someone might be talking about us, when actually people probably aren't talking about us. They're talking about the weather and the price of milk and food and cookery and their own business. And that it's all right for us not to understand. But what we do need are ways of being able to encounter one another and speak to one another in different ways and different languages. And so maybe the experience of not understanding a language is a bit like not quite getting a piece of music that we might hear for the first time.
And I think we touched upon this exact same questions in the previous Hangout, in last week's Hangout, when we said there are times when it might be important to understand what is going on, but there are times where we don't need to know what is going on, we don't need to understand, where it's not essential. There was another newspaper article a few years ago when I think it was Nigel Farage was commenting on how horrible it was that he couldn't understand people on a train, and the question is why? Why do you need to understand what people on the train are saying to each other? What is this need of control that we have?
Absolutely.
This doesn't mean, however, and I think it was one of Esteban's questions, about promoting language and promoting language education. It doesn't mean, I don't think we want to say that it's not important for people to speak. It is empowering to know a language, to know many languages. The more you know, the more empowered we think you are, including the dominant language in the place that you're living. And free courses and classes are very important, but they can't be or it's less proficient to impose them on people as an obligation than it is to open spaces in which everyone is welcome, in which people are encouraged to communicate and to be put in a situation in which they want to speak to each other. Then you learn a language because you have something to say, because you know that what other people are interested in what you have to say, and you want to speak and you want to be able to communicate it. So yes, imposing a language and saying you have to learn this and you have to learn it in the next, 6 weeks or whatever it is, it's not going to be very productive.
The history of the world is littered with examples of colonial powers imposing languages, requiring people to speak them, and then also alongside that, always with some really interesting ways people resist. But also once those powers retreat, then you find people with very damaged relationships to that language, a very strong sense this isn't a language they maybe wish to speak, that it's one that's actually had quite a damaging impact on them. And certainly reading through some of your comments on your experiences of good English, we were really touched by some of those comments of people suddenly realizing the extent of that to which that had been done by their experience of English, and that being cleared up. But I'm just looking online, and it's lovely to see a few more of you joining us. So welcome to Catherine and Lisa and Alison and Ahmed. And thank you very much for joining us. And
do you have any questions? Because we've got a few questions. Well, no, actually, it's more compliments for Tawon. That's all.
Yeah, lots more. Yeah, we'll pass those on. Thank you.
Oh, it's the same Miriam. This is hello, great. Miriam. I'm glad. Yes, so it was you that asked this question. Any more? Something about Miriam posting something about radio transmitter in their bag through a pocket radio languages bypasses impose control to promote free. Sorry, so Pocket FM in Syria is a special radio project. Anyone could carry a radio transmitter in his or her bag, and through a pocket radio language bypasses impose control to promote freedom. Thank you for that, Miriam. I actually, to be honest, never heard of that.
But that sounds like a really interesting project. And I think it does point to something very interesting about the way we put languages into technologies so that we can make them portable. So really, it's a little bit of an aside to that. But it's not unlike the way in which we often, if we're traveling abroad or we're traveling to a new place, if we're able to do that and privileged enough to do that, and it is a privilege to be able to do that, we might have in the past used phrase books and travelled with phrase books, which are often pocket size, so you can put them in your breast pocket or in your back pocket or in your handbag and take them with you. And these days we often have apps that can do that too, that will then mean that you can tap into languages and see what the languages are that are spoken in another way. So I think this aspect of the portability of languages or language materials is really interesting in what you're saying there, Miriam.
I have a half of a piece of information. In fact, I will have to check, but I remember reading recently about someone designing an app which was made for putting asylum seekers, people coming from Syria to Greece and the Balkans, and put them in touch with people that could translate for them through this app. I wonder where that is gone. And if anyone knows something about it, please let us know.
Yeah, and also I think you were raising something important that maybe links with those issues I was talking about with Jan Blombert's work on superdiversity and the digital, but also maybe to suggest you look out for Michael Cronin's work on translation in a digital age. where he's looking at the very interesting things happening as a result of us digitizing languages. Google Translate, for example, the place of the digital in the world, the way we're using digital means here as a way of trying to communicate about multilingualism, but also to communicate multilingually. And those questions that you're raising there, Miriam, about the way that transmitting can get around state control, can allow a resistance, I think fits in with some of those things we were talking about earlier about decision makers as well.
Excellent, and I see that Miriam has posted a link so that we can look at.
Yeah, that's great. So
Stephanie is says that she's very happy with their answer, and she's going to look at Pavlenko's work.
Do look out for Pavlenko's work and Blomart's work and Vertovik's work.
Yes.
And I think it's a really exciting moment in language scholarship at the moment, in the scholarship of multilingualism, of translingualism, of what it means to speak a language. The research going on right now is full of energy, full of life, is being brought life from all across the globe as people in different places make English their own, resist the ways in which English has colonized the world, ask questions about freedom and decision making, start to change the categories of languages. And I think you'll find there's some really exciting debates going on at the moment in articles, in blogs, in all the different places where language is being discussed, where multilingualism is being discussed. And many of these power issues are being thrown up as a result.
I've just conscious of time. I think I wanted to answer one of Raquel's questions about what she calls cultural and linguistic harassment and bullying, which sounds very interesting. And then we might want to touch upon Scotland's languages and our relations. And thank you, Raquel, for talking about the way in which students in English academic institutions are bullied because of the fact that they no concession is made to the fact that they're international students, and also academics that come from different countries are sometimes a sort of sidelined because they're not seen to be clear enough because they speak with an accent. And there is also research about the effect that accents have on people, and how people tend to shut down when they hear a different accent, whereas it is actually and it takes only a very short period of time to get used to the fact that words can come out with a slightly different sound, but to tune in, it doesn't take very much. And it is also something which depends on which language and which accent people have, because some accents are perceived to be more authoritative than others. So if someone speaks with an American accent, that accent is not a big problem. But if someone speaks with an African accent, then their accent is also a signal that indicates less competence. It's seen as less competent, and there are studies that show how this is the case. So this was a really interesting point, I think, made by Raquel here.
Absolutely. And I think it's very much embodied and enacted so beautifully and ironically into Wunder's poem, you know, where he's really speaking back to power and doing it with that little smile, and really trying to find a way of dealing with the power relations in language, but in a way that can maybe move us to a new place. So I think one of the things we found with post-colonial studies of language and linguistic hegemony, as we often call it, and what we're looking at here around the ways in which people will use a particular variety of language, a particular way of pronouncing to signal power, that people are speaking back to that and claiming language as their own and showing the diverse soundscapes, the diverse accents. If you think back to the history of broadcasting on the BBC, for example, you have a history where early on you would have a very a very, what we call received pronunciation. Some people call it Oxford English, some people call it Queen's English, that was spoken all the time. And varieties of English like my own, accented English from different parts of the world would just not be even present or represented and given a place. And now we do find lots of different accents regularly spoken across the English-speaking worldwide broadcasting media platform of the BBC. And we do see, again, within classrooms where English is taught, that it's no longer the idea that it has to be someone who was raised in English who would speak and teach English literature, for example, but that this can belong to many different people, that the languages written initially perhaps in the UK in English don't just belong to them. You know, for that language and that literature belongs to everybody in the world, and therefore can be accented and intoned and translated into so many different languages in different ways. And so I think these are some of the ways we see the imposition of monolingualism that you talk about, Trevor, as being a form of oppression, even an abuse of one linguistic group by another, by just silencing it, by not even recognizing it exists. We've seen it troubled in some ways within English over the last 20 to 30 years. And I think some of what we're seeing with multilingualism at the moment is that troubling again, that coming back to say, actually, there are many languages inhabiting our countries in different ways and forms. In some countries more than others, and that's very clear that there are some countries which, for example, countries like Poland or Bulgaria, which are countries which have sent migrants overseas, are often countries where there's a stronger sense of monolingualism than, say, the experience of living in London with its many different languages. It's a super diverse city, we might say. It's a multilingual city. And there are many other cities like that in the world that we can experience in similar ways. From Paris to Berlin to Singapore to New York, we'll find a similar set of soundscapes inhabiting those, which is maybe different to some of those in countries which send migrants at present to different places.
I think, keeping an eye on time, and I think we've got just a wee 5 minutes. So
a little bit more time.
Yeah. Shall we sort of address the issue of Scots and Gaelic, which was raised by was it Mariam and
Mariam and Ella, and
about the status of Gaelic and Scots in Scotland.
That's right, and maybe it's the same Mariam as has been posting these really helpful comments again as well. But yeah, so some really interesting questions there. And are you expressing your surprise that we haven't discussed the status of Gaelic and Scots in Scotland? And that was, it's lovely of you to invite us to respond on that. But also to say that in the opening video, we have a lovely example of Gaelic being sung by our Gaelic language officer for the University of Glasgow. And maybe just to say a little bit about how she came to have a role like this. So back in, I think it was 2007, the Scottish government passed the Gaelic Language Act, and this was brought into power and given what we call royal assent and became law, which meant that Gaelic became an official language of Scotland. More recently, that's been done with sign language. So sign language is now also an official language, and that comes with duties on public institutions like universities to actually respond and to come up with their own plan for how they will incorporate Gaelic or sign language, and also other languages like Scots, which is understood as the language of the poet Robert Burns, who has the famous Burns Night in January every year. So for us to think hard as public institutions, be we local authorities, town halls, schools, universities, government authorities, about how we will start to promote and use Gaelic in our work. So all kinds of interesting discussions have been had about that, quite creative discussions, but often quite heated discussions. So one of the things, for example, that's happened with Gaelic in Scotland is that signage in public places, on railway stations, also within our own university, it will now be in English and in Gaelic. So in the last 4 or 5 years, we've seen a change from a script that is only English on most of the buildings in our own institution, but also at railway stations and subways and even bus stops, to a script which is in English and also in Gaelic. So Scotland, being much more like Wales and many other countries which are multilingual officially and having those languages in play. It's been quite a bumpy shift for people. There are often letters to the newspaper complaining about this or saying it's a waste of public money.
Verbal hygiene.
Much more verbal hygiene. It's a great case study for verbal hygiene. And one of the things that sometimes certainly troubles me is that you might see English in bold type and then having to slant a little, having to bend over a little in italics or in a fainter font is Gaelic, and that makes me feel, well, it's not really quite on a par. But we've also seen places then offering Gaelic courses and Gaelic awareness lessons and helping us actually start to begin the hard work of respecting Gaelic within Scots society.
And can I just ask, sort of add on the back of that, that this has maybe not officially, but implicitly recognized the fact that it is not simply the number of speakers or the function of a language in order to gain employment that are the measuring through by which we decide if a language can be taught, if a language is important and worthy of investment or not. There are other things that we might want to consider, like in this case, heritage and the history of Scotland and the fact that Gaelic is an indigenous language in Scotland and that is in danger of dying out. And so it is not necessarily that we need to learn just the languages that are most spoken or the languages that are most useful to find jobs. And again, we go back to something that we were discussing in the first hangout. So we need to be clear about why we want to teach and learn the language. And there might be different considerations that we might want to bring in, which might also link to...
well, I think that links really nicely, and perhaps as one of our final points, to Alistair's point about language decisions and spending justifications. And I think it does show that some of these questions do come back to the decision makers and the question about how we use resources in education in particular, but also how we use resources in families and in other areas. And one of the questions that Alistair asks is about the languages, two of the languages from parts of the Horn of Africa, particularly Eritrea and then also Ethiopia, Tigrinya and Bilen. And these are languages spoken by many of the refugees who have come from Eritrea and Ethiopia. And we're starting to see their presence in some of the arrival cities and the welcoming cities for refugees. And Alistair's sort of saying, what would be the justification for financial spending on teaching and learning what he calls niche languages here? And I think that's it's an important question because I think there are deeper philosophical questions underneath that than, as Giovanna was just saying, just the number of people who are speaking it. It's useful and important for us to invest in intercultural relations. It's important for us to invest in mutual understanding. We can invest in people learning English at a local level, and Trevor was also asking that question about people learning that language, but we are hugely enriched by the languages people bring to us, by different ways of understanding, and also by allowing people as part of that welcome and allowing ourselves to experience what it's like to learn a really different language that's come from another part of the world. By learning to say, for example, in Tigrinya, Anlachi Muskan as part of a greeting, or by learning to speak of potatoes as dinish. So just to begin to do that, or learning that the word for mint in Tigrinya is nana, which is the same as it is in Arabic. And what does that then tell us about language patterns and movements and language contact in the past? That means that we come to a place where we might share those words. So I think there's lots of rationales for how we make decisions about what we learn. And for me, for example, if a school has many people from a particular area or a particular language group, then it's really worth giving pupils a mutual sense of mutual understanding, yes, by learning English, but also maybe by investing some resource in enabling the language plenty that Katya talks about in her blog and her reflections of Tigrinya or of Bilen or of Arabic or of Urdu or Punjabi or whatever the language might be that is spoken in a school
Polish.
in more numbers. And in particular, Polish in Glasgow at the moment, that's one of the real experiences we're having, and you'll hear about this from Elvira next week, that Polish is a very important language of migration, part of our new migratory aesthetics, part of the lovely way in which people are starting to use Polish in everyday life within our own city. And you might be able to think of examples in the cities or the places where you live, where you can also see that people are learning other languages, just beginning to use different words, and then creating together a new migratory aesthetic, a new soundscape that's part of how we learn to live together in these multilingual worlds.
Okay, what do you think? I think we've now over our time. With just double checking questions. I think we've got all the questions.
Some lovely comments back to Wana for his poems, so thank you for those. We'll definitely pass those on to him, and he would want to say Hekani, that's his greeting to you all. And also Hekani can mean, as we've come to learn from him, congratulations as well, or it's a way of saying thank you and well done. So perhaps that's what we should say to you and how we should end in that spirit. For your questions, for your participation, for all your comments through our online learning platform this week, and it's an amazing experience for us.
Really amazing.
It's really wonderful. So thank you so much for all the time and energy you've put into it. And we'll see you maybe next week for the next Google Hangout, and also for our online in the comments forums, to be able to talk more about it. So in that spirit, I think we'll both just end by saying Hekani.
Hekani.